Yes, can everyone hear me now? Perfect, excellent. Well, deutsche Pünktlichkeit, not so sure, maybe Berliner Pünktlichkeit, but we'll, we'll get going, I think, now. We have a full room. So Dr. Tobias Kremer is joining us from Brussels, where he's in the European Parliament. We will be doing full introductions shortly. He cannot see you, but we can obviously see him, and we will have a microphone that will be passed around later for your questions. So, without further ado, of course, as you will all know, on February 23rd, Germany went to the polls. A transformative election that has set the stage for new and a likely more contentious and potentially unstable phase in the evolution of the Federal Republic. Notably, 1 in 5 Germans, of course, cast their ballots for the far-right Alternative für Deutschland, or Alternative for Germany party, or AfD, which was accompanied also by surge in support for Die Linke, for the left party. This next parliament will therefore look very different from the last, of course, which saw a social democratic, green, and liberal traffic light coalition, as it was called, first rise to power amid quite a lot of promise. Of course, this was in the pre-invasion of Ukraine era. But then, of course, ignominiously collapse before it's due. And the infighting and acrimony that we saw, of course, that characterized it, also, of course, shaded this recent election. And one of the big points here, of course, for many in the electorate was arguably its apparent inability to actualize its agenda and promises, not least the Zeitenwende, which I'm sure our speakers will also delve into. Today, set against the backdrop of a second Trump administration and the ongoing transatlantic fallout over Ukraine, which has left governments scrambling right across the continent, not just in Berlin, and amidst ongoing economic malaise and societal unease, where, the question is, right, this is the title of our talk today, our panel, where is Germany headed? What is the future of Europe's largest economy under a future Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and yet another grand coalition bringing together both the center right and center left? Joining us to tackle these questions is a very distinguished panel. We're genuinely very honored to have all of our speakers here today, including Dr. Tobias Kremer, a Cambridge alum who now serves as MEP for the Social Democratic Party of Germany in Brussels. We have Dr. Martin Röhl, an academic here at Cambridge, who I'm sure many of you here will know, and Anglo-German historian Katja Heuer here, who is also a recognized and distinguished expert in this area. So again, we're bringing together people representing a breadth of aspects here that are very important to the discussion that will follow. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Dr. Kremer. Tobias, hopefully you can hear me, and you have the floor. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Yes, I can hear you and I can see you, even though it's interesting when you talk to me and address me, you're actually looking away from me because of the way the whole setting is done. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always delightful to be back at Cambridge, and especially in a Peter House setting as a Patreon. And I will apologize for having been slightly late.
Toby, I'm afraid I have to correct you there. We're at Newnham.
You're in Newnham. Oh,
beautiful.
Very good as well.
Room here at Newnham.
So I thought that would be was in the old bursary, but I apologize to Newnham, and I'm all the more delighted to be at Newnham, but still a Patreon. Anyways, I wanted to actually apologize for being slightly late and for being a bad German in this respect, but it was for a very good reason. I'm just coming out of the Parliamentary Assembly with the United Kingdom and in the European Parliament. So we are just having colleagues from the House of Commons and House of Lords here in Brussels, and we were just talking about some of the issues that you mentioned already, namely the double crisis we are facing externally with the Russian threat and the American retreat, and then at the same time the internal crises we are facing in many European countries. And as Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think my British colleagues and I were trying to do exactly that for the last couple of hours. So apologies for being slightly late, but I'm all the more delighted that we can be here right now. And I already mentioned to Trev, you'd be delighted to hear from a politician. I haven't prepared a long talk because I'm actually much more interested in the conversation we have, but I can maybe just give you a brief overview over also the last couple of days and weeks here, and how the German elections have actually been perceived. I mean, I personally ended up campaigning quite a bit because I was only elected last year before I was a career diplomat, and as a result, I've almost not come out of campaign mode basically since the European elections last summer, and that is already shows you that in some ways the Germany actually I feel hasn't really gotten out of campaign mode in all that time, and in some ways that was not just bad for Germany but actually really bad for Europe, because in some ways there's something of a European of a Germany shaped hole which we noticed over the last couple of months in Europe, because the last government was, and we can discuss it for the reasons for that, but in some ways not really capable of at least initiating initiatives. That was the impression I got here, but it was actually very interesting. Although I had been campaigning in Germany for a lot of the campaign, I actually didn't watch the elections in Germany. I couldn't watch the elections in Germany because I went to Ukraine for the 3rd anniversary of the Russian aggression. And it was a really interesting experience actually being on that train on the 23rd of February, watching the German election results come in while being on that famous sleeper train from Poland to Ukraine, and we had the whole commission, basically the whole European Commission on that train. We had a lot of politicians from all sorts of different countries and parties, and it was a really odd feeling because in some ways you'd think that we would be really focused on going to Ukraine in that very, very tense situation just after the Munich Security Conference, and basically this whole shock we all had after JD Vance basically declaring the American exit from the Western Alliance, to put it in somewhat sharper terms. But what was interesting was actually nobody talked about Ukraine at that moment. Nobody talked about the US at that moment. Everybody talked about Germany at that moment. And I think that really showed us that in some ways we had been in a time capsule in Germany. It almost felt like we discussed a lot about domestic issues. We discussed a lot about the ins and outs of financial policy. We discussed a lot about migration, while at the same time, the world kept turning. And actually, for me, it was often surprising that in the German debate, we did really recognize, I think, to the sufficient extent, what a moment in history we are facing right now, where on the one hand we see Russia rearming and preparing to the extent to be able to attack NATO territory by as early as 2028, 2029. So what all our intelligence services are telling us. And at the same time, probably for the first time in 80 years, we are facing this very serious threat without the security and the knowledge that America will, in the worst case scenario, get us out. So in some way, this I think is actually an even more profound Zeitenwende, if you want to use that term, than maybe the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think in some ways I was always surprised that perhaps didn't get the recognition in the German campaign that it maybe should have. It changed a little bit in the last week, but being on that train and talking to a lot of politicians and also like Ukrainians, and realizing how the world had been looking at Germany and waiting for Germany to actually act, especially as the US was retreating, I think showed us that there really was this Germany-shaped hole, and it shows the responsibility that Germany has now, also on the European and the global sphere. I mean, for me, afterwards, I spent a couple of days in Ukraine. We spoke to a lot of politicians, but we also met soldiers from the front lines. I met a couple of children who had been abducted by Russia, and who, under very, very dangerous circumstances, had found their way back to Ukraine. And I was actually almost embarrassed to realize that these people knew how the German 5% barrier worked, the threshold, to realize that these people had been really following the ins and outs of German politics, while we really hadn't recognized the importance of our own elections for the global sphere. So that maybe just as a background, and then to move at the question, what does this now mean for the role of Germany now? I think the positive thing that I've seen over the last couple of days is a shift out of this time capsule that we seem to have had during the campaign, and really maybe also because of the results, the way it was, it actually was only possible to have a coalition between Social Democrats and conservatives because of how it worked out that the BSW, the left-wing populist party, didn't get in, and the Greens were too weak to form a government. So there was only one option, and I had the impression that really focused people's minds on both sides, on both parties. And I'm very, very glad that we actually managed to move quite quickly to have the whatever it takes approach, as Friedrich Merz put it, and to really see, for German standards, light speed in terms of coalition negotiations, and that also the Greens are ready to participate in that. I also think it's really important that we move the financial part. I mean, I don't know how much knowledge is already there, but basically part of the reason why the old government failed and why the old government for almost a year was incapable of acting had been a constitutional court judgment that was basically saying the way they had planned their budget wouldn't work, and at the same time we had the German debt break, which basically meant that you couldn't spend more, or you couldn't take more debt than a very, very limited threshold, which meant that on the positive side, Germany was probably the least indebted G7 country or major Western country, but on the other hand, really meant that the government couldn't implement many of their plans. And in some ways, ever since we've had that judgment from the Constitutional Court in 2023, or 2024, don't remember when exactly it was, but basically ever since we had this coalition crisis, and the first thing that the new government is now trying to do, and we will have the vote on that tomorrow, is to move this debt break, is to reform that debt break, basically saying that defense spending will be exempted from that, and then on the other hand, combining this though with a 500 billion investment plan in infrastructure, because what we have seen over the last couple of years is really this lack of investment, both in defense, and this is where the Zeitenwende tried to come in, but we now see very clearly that even the 100 billion were nowhere near enough. And then on the other hand as well, though, that we really see that our infrastructure is struggling. Actually, when you talk to businesses, it's really the infrastructure that causes the main trouble. It's not even labor laws or labor costs, but really that part. So I'm very glad that this has now been moved and established, and that the speed is going there. But I really think from a geopolitical perspective, in the sense of geopolitics, this is all the more necessary. I have now not touched on the reasons for the rise of the far right. Nor have I touched on the reasons for also the rise of the far left, nor for my party's own defeat, the worst defeat since 1890. I'm very happy to go into all that. As Trev knows, I've written a PhD on the rise of the far right, but I don't know whether you want me to say a few words on that now. I've now focused more on the geopolitical side. Otherwise, we can also do that in the discussion.
Sure. Why don't you give us a bit now, and then a taster, and then we can delve more into it in the Q&A afterwards.
Okay, at your own risk. No, I won't summarize the PhD, but I do think basically what we've been seeing in Germany, and in some respect, Germany is not alone in that, is a double crisis over the last couple of years domestically. So we have the external crisis that I just discussed, but I also think there has been a very profound domestic crisis, and the one part of that I think is not a very surprising crisis of identity. So basically, if you think about historically, our societies were very much ordered according to collective identities, and also our social cleavages or social divides were very much ordered according to that. So on the one hand, you had an economic divide between like basically labor and capitalism. That was the class struggle, if you like to think of it in this way. And then on the other hand, you had culture wars between social conservatism and social liberalism. And if you think about that like a 2x2 matrix, you could very easily place most political parties. But what we've seen over the last couple of decades is really an erosion of the identities underlying these cleavages. So on the one hand, you have an erosion of class identity with like deindustrialization, also globalization, the way our economy works. And then on the other hand, you had an erosion of things like religious identity, regional identity that was underlying to some extent the other cleavage. And as a result, in some ways, and we can discuss about the best name for that. A lot of scholars have called it divide between cosmopolitans and communitarians. Others have called it the somewheres against the anywheres. But in some ways, both of that is really reflecting, I think, a crisis of identity wherein with developments such secularization, deindustrialization, globalization, rapid ethnic change, there is this moment of also internal transition where we as a society ask ourselves, who are we? Who is the other? Who belongs to society? Who doesn't? What are the defining sources of collective identity that will shape the future? And one big cleavage, as I mentioned, that is arising is really to ask, how are we going to define that? And then on the one hand, you have maybe a more liberal approach that is much more individualist, cosmopolitan, that is saying we are focusing on individuals. And then on the other hand, you have a much more communitarian approach that is basically trying to fill this identitarian crisis with ultimately nationalistic sources of identity in the absence of other collective sources of identity. So I think in some ways this is in some ways also relatively normal. That happens every few decades. But I think we are in that context, and I think this is why migration has become such a politicized issue, because it represents this identitarian crisis. But that is only one half of that. But I think we can talk a lot about that also, especially with the other panelists with regards to Eastern Germany, etc. But I do think that is something that we can see in many Western societies at the moment. But the second crisis, that in some ways is much less often talked about, is also a crisis of the state and of the ability of the state to fulfill its functions. And that might sound a little bit abstract, but in a way, this is a bit of a crisis of democracy. And we often talk about how we're defending liberal democracy against the onslaught of populism, of extremism, etc. But actually, if you think about it, liberal democracy, of course, we see it as something that belongs together. But of course, there's an internal tension between liberalism and democracy. Democracy, the rule of the majority, and liberalism is also the protection of the right of the individual, also against the rule of the majority. And we have found a very good equilibrium, I think, in liberal democracies where you have both. You have the democratic part, but also in some ways republican, or the idea of the republic, of really creating a framework of rule of law in which that is to happen. And I think in some ways what we've seen is that over years there is a sense that the democratic part, or that is a narrative that the democratic part has been going down, or has been more and more restricted, partly because we have moved political decisions into the realm of law, and especially constitutional law. So that you have this criticism that actually thinks, and this is why the debt brake is, I think, a very important example, that you have politicians who say we are going to change this and that, and then they're coming back and actually saying, oh, we can't. We can't, for reasons that are like, it's just we can't finance that, so there is no ability to act. Also reasons of other, and for instance, the European Union, where I work for, is all about setting these constraints. But I think there is this sense of a crisis that very often there's a democratic decision, and then there's the sense that actually politics can't implement what it said it can do. And I think in some ways that's really, really good when it comes to the protection of minority rights. But I think we also have to be very honest that in some ways we might have actually, and when I say we, I say politicians, we might have actually moved uncomfortable decisions that are inherently political decisions. We are trying to move them into the courts. We are trying to move them into constitutional law. And actually, these should be political discussions and political debates, and we sometimes just end them. And I think this is a real frustration that I see with a lot of voters who are saying, you can tell us whatever you want, you can't change it anyways, because there are all these rules, etc., or you don't have the money to do this. And I think this is actually a crisis where we, as a society, need to find a solution where we in some ways re-justify the equilibrium of liberal democracy, that we explain why we need a framework and also barriers and checks and balances for democratic will, but maybe where we also say some discussions have to be political. And I think, for instance, the question of budgets should be an inherently political rather than a constitutional debate. And we have to have these uncomfortable discussions, but I think this is what politics and democratic society is about. And I'm saying this in some ways now more as a former academic than just as a party politician. But I think this is really one of the frustrations I see with a lot of voters, the sense that actually the state is incapable of enacting political decisions that are taken. And I think this double crisis is what we are seeing at the moment, where a lot of the frustration is coming from. But I've probably now talked 15 minutes anyways, even though I said I wouldn't. But so I leave it at that with these two tasters, and I'm actually really looking forward to learning from the other two panelists, and they can tell me how I'm wrong or where I've gone in the wrong way. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Toby. And again, I think as is the case with any kind of hybrid event like this, our focus is really on making sure that we actually heard from Dr. Kremer. So we actually went straight to it, and I didn't have a chance to properly introduce him. And just so we all know, because I think we are all very grateful, Toby, that you made time in your very busy schedule. Toby, as I mentioned before, is, of course, an MEP for the SPD in Brussels. But again, interestingly, I think especially and relevantly for our discussion, he serves on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Subcommittee on Security and Defense in the Parliament. So again, there's a lot that we can delve into further. And as he mentioned as well, he has also served and is a member of the Delegation for Relations with both the US and the Delegation for Relations with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So even more, I think, to delve into later there. Previously, of course, he was at the Federal Foreign Office, as was also mentioned briefly previously, but perhaps out of interest for all of us here, Toby was an academic both here in Cambridge before, where he did his PhD. We did it together at Peterhouse, and after which he was a research fellow at Pembroke College, Oxford. And his book, The Godless Crusade, Religion, Populism, and Right-Wing Identity Politics in the West, I'm sure will also come into play during the Q&A. So again, can we please give a big round of applause for Dr. Kremer. No less distinguished is my next guest, or our next guest, rather. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome Katja Hoyer, who is a British-German historian, journalist, a visiting research fellow at King's College London, and fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Her well-received books include Blood and Iron, The Rise and Fall of the German Empire, 1871 to 1918, and Beyond the Wall, East Germany, 1949 to 1990, which was a Sunday Times bestseller and which was longlisted for the prestigious Baillie Gifford Prize. A columnist for the Berliner Zeitung, Katja also regularly writes for The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, and Unheard, has worked as a columnist for The Washington Post, and has contributed to the Financial Times, The Times, The Guardian, and Die Welt, covering current political affairs in Germany and Europe, and to TV productions for Sky, History, ITV, and German public broadcasters on topical issues in Germany. She also co-hosts the New Germany podcast for the Kobe Foundation. So again, Katja, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. My main point during this very brief talk is actually connected to what Dr. Kremer just said last about the idea that German politicians frequently say they can't do things because there are various rules and regulations in place that prevent them from doing things, or whether the circumstances are such that they can't do things. Angela Merkel famously used to tell people that her politics are Alternativlos, without alternative. And there was always a sense that politicians just had to do the one thing that they were doing, and that there was literally no other way of doing things. And as we've just heard, that's very frustrating to a lot of voters who often want different things from what German politicians are doing. And so if the question for this panel this evening is what's next for Germany, then I would say that perhaps a bit more strategy, a bit more strategic thinking should be next. So the idea that German politicians have got a vision, a kind of idea as to where things should be going, and then actually try and implement that, obviously within reason. You know, I'm not sort of saying let's overturn European law or German law in order to do things, but I do think it's no longer good enough for politicians to stand there and basically say, look, we appreciate that this is what you want, dear voters, but we can't do it. So tough, because I think if you carry on doing that, you end up with what we've seen in some other Western democracies, including the United States, where eventually you do get people coming to power who say, I don't care what the rules are, I'm just going to do what people tell me to do. And I think that's where Germany is beginning to head in the same direction, and what needs to basically stop, I think, if mainstream politics is to survive. So just a sort of idea on 4 topics very briefly as to what Germany can do strategically, I think, to move forwards with these. And then hopefully those will provide some discussion points for our debate later. So as we've just discussed, basically there's a huge debate happening or a huge decision made in the German parliament tomorrow on budget and on defense. And so I just want to briefly say something on that, because I think with the special budget that we've already had of 100 billion that Olaf Scholz spent to sort of fund his Zeitenwende, and now the increased spending that we're going to have with a loosening of the debt brake on defense, the big question has surely got to be, what is this for? You know, what is Germany actually going to do, and in sort of what direction is it going to move with this idea? I mean, what we've seen, I think, with the 100 billion that have been allocated already now, is that Germans have got this nice word of a sort of Gießkannen approach, you know, the idea that you sprinkle water over everything a little bit, and then surely everything is going to grow nicely. But that's exactly the problem, I think, when you do that with defense in particular, is that you spend money on this, that, and the other, but there's no real strategy there, or kind of an idea as to what this is for. And ultimately, the problem with that is that you're asking young Germans to now defend the country or fight for the country, but without any sort of identity or vision or some sort of idea as to what the German military is actually going to fight for in the future. And I think it's too vague what Germany has done in the past during the Cold War and then afterwards to sort of look to the US, or if you're the sort of Eastern-minded German, of whom there are also many, look to Russia to kind of look for orientation, or sit somewhere in the middle. Both of these poles have suddenly collapsed. Russia with the invasion of Ukraine, and the US now basically with its withdrawal of security guarantees from Europe. So Germany will have to look to itself and to Europe to find some sort of new meaning as to what its military is for. And only then can you ask young Germans to put their lives on the line if you're telling them what they're doing it for. I think otherwise you'll struggle recruiting people, you'll struggle filling all those new positions, and Germany has already got a massive recruitment crisis as far as the Bundeswehr is concerned, and it's no good having all that gear without the idea as to what you're actually going to do with that. So that's a huge area where Germany, I think, needs a grand strategy for, you know, as we're here at the center of geopolitics, where these things are often discussed. But Germany is one of the few countries, a few sort of G7 countries that doesn't actually think about what it wants to achieve with its, or what its interests even are and how to achieve them. I think the second big area is immigration. That's because it's basically in every single poll that you looked at over the last couple of years or so, it comes out as one of the top issues that Germans are concerned about. And I think we can't sort of, you know, move forward. And when I say we, I mean sort of observers and the political class, journalists, academics, and sort of pretend that this is all in people's minds, it is something that people really perceive to be as a rapid change in their environment, where they live, in their towns, in their villages. I think in Germany in particular, because it has basically got a sort of universal key that it applies when migrants arrive, where then, I think it's a good idea, basically people arrive and they're not just dumped in the cities, but they're actually spread out across the country, which helps with resources. But it does mean that everywhere across Germany, people have seen a direct impact on the environment that they live in. So suddenly their town halls, their sports halls were being used to house refugees. They've seen their own local communities being overwhelmed in terms of resources and in terms of the way that they couldn't cope with this. They've seen crime rates go up, and that's part of the truth as well. And all of these things, I think, need a genuine discussion, and Germany needs to again, apply some strategy to this and think about its immigration policy as a more strategic thing. Because at the moment, we've got a complete confusion of how to solve Germany's demographic crisis, how to solve its gaps in the labor market, and asylum policy, all kind of mixed into one. So if people are starting to criticize one bit or the other of this, the argument is suddenly coming from a different direction. So somebody may say, my local community hasn't got enough money to house another 500 refugees, so what do we do? And the argument is, oh, but Germans are getting older, so we need these people coming in. That's all a very confused debate. I think there needs to be an overall strategy. What is immigration for in Germany? How is it organized? And how does the country move forward? And I think if you have that, you take the wind out of the sails of the far right a lot, because people can then see where it's going. And it's no longer the case that the authorities just say, I can't deal with this, so sorry, you'll just have to put up with things as they are. Because if we carry on doing that, then that provides enough fertile ground for the AfD to step into. Third area is the economy. I think it does need a lot more strategy than to say, let's pour 500 billion euros into it without an idea as to where this is going or how it's going to be allocated. I know there are two aims now attached to that. One's climate change. So with the idea being that net zero is being written into the sort of constitution as one of the aims for which this money can be spent. And the other is infrastructure, but they're both so vague that it's not really clear as to how Germany imagines this money or its economy is going to work in the future. And if, some of the books that have come out recently, I think we got some here as well as sort of props, if I can borrow this very quickly. But that book by Wolfgang Münchau, for example, that came out quite recently, describes quite well about how Germany's economic model isn't working any longer. And I think this dependency on exports that has basically worked as Germany's fundamental model for basically since Germany existed in the 19th century, is now coming under a lot of pressure with the world economy not being what it is anymore, a trade war going on with the US and with China potentially. So there needs to once again be a strategy there as to how is Germany going to transform its economy and how can this transition be made as painless as possible. Because I think if you take the auto industry, car industry as one example, and it's just decided that combustion engines are going to be phased out by 2035 without any idea as to what this means to the German economy when you do that, because it's obviously not just the actual car manufacturing, but all the contributing industries. There's millions of jobs dependent on that directly. Then maybe that transition needs to be managed somehow. If that's what you want to do, fine, but then there needs to be a strategy again, how you manage that and how you use the extra funds that have just been made available to do that. I would suggest that there should be a slower transition from Germany's economic model to where it's going, to ease that, the economic impact and the pain a little bit, because otherwise, again, it provides fuel to extremist forces who will just say, no, Germany's existing model works and we're just going to go back to a more industrialized society, as the AfD is saying. And last area, and I find it absolutely appalling how little strategy there is on energy. I think it's just mind-boggling how all of the political parties seem to, and sorry there, Dr. Kremer, but there seems to just be an assumption that this is sorted as an issue. It was basically before the invasion of Ukraine, we had 1/3 of German coal, 1/3 of German oil, and 2/3 of German gas coming from Russia. And yes, Germany has reopened some of its coal mines. I'm not sure that's supposed to be a long-term solution, but it very much looks like one at the moment, even though there is a fixed date as to when it's going to be sort of phased out. But nonetheless, the fact that Germany still produces at times 1/3 of its electricity using coal You know, it's a shocking thing, I think, that we've kind of gone back to that. And at the same time, there doesn't really seem to be a long-term strategy how to replace these things, or whether an establishment of relations with Russia should be restored, or whether they're moving towards sort of buying LNG permanently on the world market. But that's been a big scramble for the last 3 years. We've seen Robert Habeck, of all people, going to the Qataris and begging for sort of LNG, and part of that came from the US. What's going to happen with that, I don't know. But when we're thinking about the trade war that is going on with the United States right now, buying LNG just randomly where it's available on the world market doesn't seem to be a particularly good strategy. And if the answer to that is more renewables, yes, of course, but that takes a long time to get the battery capacities up to scratch. We've seen this last year with the so-called Dunkelflaute moments, where basically you've just got spells of weather where it's sort of dark and cold for long periods of time. That's what happened at the end of last year, and then suddenly Germany was sucking so much electricity out of the European network that prices spiked up in Norway and Sweden and in other places, who were suddenly basically thinking about changing their own legislation so as to not to export all of that energy to Germany when Germany needs it, because of its rapacious economy, which always needs kind of permanent energy. So one way or another, there needs to be some sort of solution, and I can't see it at the moment in any of the party manifestos. And again, the fact that energy prices are as high as they are, and they are being subsidized at the same time, which also presumably isn't supposed to be a permanent state of affairs. If you carry on with that, again, there's the AfD sitting there saying, why don't we just restore relations with Russia, problem solved? And people, especially in Eastern Germany, will sit there and think, yeah, why not? And instantly you have implications on security, on populism, and all the rest of it. So these are just 4 areas. You could look at others, like, I don't know, education, for instance, I think is one of those things in Germany that's completely dysfunctional and produces very, very unfair social imbalances, and has done over generations. There's lots of issues that need long-term solutions. But I would say overall the big thing is I would like the next government to basically apply a bit more thinking, a bit more long-term thinking and strategy to what it's doing, whichever areas it's actually looking at. I don't think people expect problems to be solved in the next 4 years, but they do expect there to be some sort of plan as to where it's heading, rather than another government that just manages things from one day to the next. And that would solve, I think, a lot of the issues, particularly with a view to populism.
I'm Martin Ruhl. I teach German history here at Cambridge. I want to hear your views, especially on the rise of the AfD. So I'm going to keep this very brief. I'll just say a few words about Friedrich Merz and the new government, and then maybe how we should evaluate the AfD. Is it a neo-fascist party? Is it a right-wing extremist party? And so on. About the Merz government. So in the FT, in the Financial Times, but also in Le Monde, there's enormous hope, enormous confidence in Merz marking a new start. In a way, the idea is, as Dr. Kremer said just now, that Merz might be implementing the Zeitenwende that Scholz was only talking about, sort of putting the German money where Scholz's mouth was. I really feel that this is not going to happen precisely because, as Katja just said, Merz is lacking a vision, right? He's also constrained by the situation. He's only got 28%. He needed the SPD and the Green Party to even get this through the old Bundestag, through the old parliament. And it was diluted already through the negotiations with the SPD, but even more so with Die Grünen. So I really cannot see this being a real caesura. There's a massive sense in which Merz wants to spend but doesn't really know what to spend on. So he says that we can no longer rely on American protection. Fair enough. So what are we going to do? Is Germany now going to step into the cowboy boots of America and be the policeman, as it were, of Eastern Europe? Surely not. Germany's, even with an unlimited defense spending, cannot do that. Simply cannot do this. Also has to rely, of course, on its European partners. Germany is, as of now, as you all know, not even a nuclear power. Also, Germany is, and this is where my own view on this comes in, right? Should this even be the role of Germany to play in Eastern Europe vis-a-vis Russia, yeah? As a protector, as a guarantor of the borders, the geopolitical existences of countries like Estonia, the Baltic states, Belarus, and so on. Germany is das Land der Mitte, right? It's been defined literally forever through its Mittellage. And that means also Mittlerlage, right? That means it's a mediator between East and West. I really think this kind of the aggressive thinking behind Merz's spending on the military, potentially unlimited spending on the military, is misguided. Should be about negotiation, should be about peace talks. Do we really believe, and I'm saying this here, I know at the Center for Geopolitics, should we really believe that Russia's next step is to re-establish, as it were, the boundaries of the former Russian Empire or the Soviet Union? Russia's experience in Ukraine was extremely humiliating. They could not win that war. They had to bring in North Korean units to fight that war. Does that make us think that Russia is likely to attack the Baltic states or Moldova? Probably not. So what is this spending for? I completely agree with Katja that there is no vision, there is no strategy. And the one person in German politics who represented this absence of vision more than anyone else in the last 40 years was Angela Merkel. And I think this election in 2025 was a response to a backlash against not the very unpopular Scholz government, but the Merkel government. It's sort of a belated echo or commentary, if you want, on what Merkel did, or rather what she did not do. And the two things, Merkel was great at Verwaltung, administration, managing, but she didn't do anything at all, right? She completely lacked any positive ideas, any creative energies. The two moments where she actually proactively did something went tragically wrong. That was Fukushima, and that was 2015, her open door policy during the European refugee crisis. Two massive mistakes, long-term, for Germany, right? Changed German politics completely, and we would not have the AfD to the extent that we have it now if Merkel had not ceded that territory on the right of the German political spectrum to that party, the AfD. So this is very important, and this is one thing we expect from Merz, that he reclaims to some extent that territory. That's the only way to decrease the support for the AfD. You don't defeat the AfD with candlelit demonstrations in Berlin. You defeat it by addressing the issues that made it powerful, that made it popular, and that means seriously changing Germany's asylum policy and border controls, things like this. And this is, I think, one of the number one issues on Merz's, has to be on Merz's agenda. Very briefly about the AfD. I'm against the demonization of the AfD. I think it's a big mistake. I think it's beginning to polarize German politics in a way that politics have become polarized in the United States. Even calling the AfD a right-wing extremist, rechtsextreme Partei, for me is misguided. Yes, we are now allowed by the Verfassungsschutz to apply that label to the AfD. In Teilen gesichert, rechtsextrem, that's all nonsense, right? Extremism means planning or plotting the violent overthrow of the existing government, right? If anybody looks at the Wahlprogramm of the AfD, there's nothing like that in there. You might find this with the Reichsbürger, you might have found this with the NSU, right? The problem with labeling a party fascist or neo-fascist is that you cry wolf too many times. There are real fascists out there. The AfD is not one of them. Alice Weidel is doing to the AfD what Marine Le Pen has been doing with the Rassemblement National, formerly Front National, for 10 years now, I think. Moving it to the center, moderating it, making it more acceptable. Now, we might think of the AfD what we want, but we have to deal with it as a party. In Germany, the sovereign is the people. If 20% of every fifth person of the sovereign votes for this party, then this needs to be addressed. They cannot simply be marginalized, be demonized. I think that's a big mistake. And this brings me to the end of my very brief talk. I think Germany's contemporary politics are still very much happening, taking place, are very much determined by the German past. It's the Holocaust in particular. It's 50, 60 years of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And somehow the Germans thought that 60 years of Gedächtniskultur would make them immune against the rise of the AfD. Well, it turns out it's almost the opposite. So I think Germany has to find, in German political discourse, German intellectual discourse, has to find a new attitude, a new relationship to the country's past, to dealing with this, right? There was a massive outcry in 2018. Alexander Gauland, one of the leaders of the AfD, called the Holocaust ein Vogelschiss, right? Sort of an annoying accident in otherwise, 1,000 years of great German history. If you actually look at that Gauland speech, Gauland says right before that remark, which is offensive, which is disgusting, no doubt about it. But Gauland says right before it, wir bekennen uns zu diesen 12 Jahren, the 12 years of Nazi rule, deutscher Geschichte, und wir tragen die Verantwortung für sie, and we bear the responsibility for it forever. He says that. Yeah? And I think the mainstream of the AfD acknowledges that too. And it's very important to attain, to acquire a different relationship, I think, to the AfD, but also to that part of the German past for us, right? For me, that kind of relationship would mean what Kant said with respect to Aufklärung, nämlich der Ausgang der Deutschen, I'm adopting Kant here, aus ihrer selbstverschuldeten Unmündigkeit, right? The Germans' departure from their self-incurred immaturity.
Well, Dr. Rühl is a very modest man and didn't allow me to introduce him properly. But I'll just say that the eloquence of, I think, those remarks is probably represented best by the fact that he is the winner of the Pilkington Prize for Teaching Excellence here at Cambridge. So that's all I will say, because I know that's all you want me to.
That prize will be taken away from me after those remarks.
However, and we will come to audience questions shortly. But I know a number of those points will, of course, be debated. We are here to exchange different positions on this. And I know, Toby, you have done a lot of work on this. So I want to return to you, if you will, and see what you would like to respond to those interventions just now. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you first of all. I'm not sure whether people can always see my face. I'm trying to keep my my face in order, but like some of the things I did want to say something about and actually also contradict, especially the last point. I completely agree that like just focusing on how terrible the AfD is not the solution, and the anti-AfD campaigning of both 2024 and 2025 has actually not worked. I will say though, it is completely the other way around. It is actually like there are loads and loads of stuff. We see that it's exactly not the path that Marine Le Pen has been taking. What we see in the AfD is exact opposite of that. What we have seen with the AfD is actually a radicalization. The AfD started as a professor's party that was very like neoliberal when it came to economics, but actually not traditionally right-wing populist, extremist, nativist like other parties. But what we saw over the years, and this is what you see like pretty much everywhere in the literature, is a radicalization. So you saw the first level radicalization in 2016 when they basically moved from economics to immigration, and then you see radicalization 2018, 19, 20, and then you see another wave of radicalization now, where initially they were very clear about saying like we want to get rid of people like Björn Höcke even, who are very open about their even admiration for the Nazi time, and you can publicly call him a Nazi because like our like the courts have actually shown that he's systematically using as references, and that is exactly opposite way. I'm sitting in the European Parliament, and I can see the far right groups and right-wing populist groups in other countries, and they have been moving in a similar way as Professor was saying. they were trying to move into the center. The AfD is going the exact opposite way. The AfD is actually radicalizing. The AfD is actually now trying to provoke and actually referencing the Third Reich. And that is very, very different, which is why even in the European Parliament, even parties like Marine Le Pen have kicked out the AfD because of their references to say how good the SS was, that there were such good people in the SS, etc., etc. So I think we have to be very, very clear, and the literature is showing that very clearly. The AfD is actually moving in a completely different direction.
Okay, then how about the dissolution of der Flügel around Höcke, and how about the dissolution of Junge Alternative? To me, these are very clear moderating movements.
I mean, I can just invite everybody to listen to Alice Weidel's speech just before the election at the party conference. That was very, very clearly not moving towards the center. That was very, very clearly trying to move towards the extreme. There are two strategies in far-right movements. One is to say we are moving to the center. That's the de-diabolisation that Marine Le Pen has been doing. And the other one is the further radicalization that has been spearheaded by, for instance, the FPÖ in Germany, in Austria, and the AfD in Germany has very clearly been going in that way. And I think that is just the way. I mean, afterwards you can discuss whether that's good or bad and what you do about it. I completely agree that we shouldn't just be talking about the AfD, but I actually think we have to be also open and clear about, if we see these very clear movements of radicalization in the AfD, we can't pretend that they're going in the other direction. That doesn't mean that the call campaign should be about diabolizing the AfD. We actually see that going on their topics, either just talking about them and saying how terrible they are, or going on their topics and just saying, okay, we now have to do everything what the AfD is asking in terms of anti-migration policy. Actually, all statistics we see, The Economist just brought out a new analysis of that, of a lot of academic papers, of the latest academic numbers that were showing very clearly that actually only strengthens far-right parties. The area where you if you actually want to move away and weaken far-right parties is to address the problems, but actually move onto turf, move to, so to speak, to the cleavages where the far-right doesn't have ownership. We saw that in 2021, where actually the campaign was not about migration, where the campaign was about living standards, where the campaign was about respect for labor, where the campaign was about being able to pay rent. All of these things, these were the points where the AfD actually has no issue ownership, but where Social Democrats, for instance, issue ownership, and this is why they managed to do that. If we only move to the culture wars and identity politics and migration, then you actually strengthen the far right. So this is why I would always say we have to actually, as politicians, move to the bread and butter issues. We have to address the problem of immigration, but not by taking up the far right's rhetoric about it, but by being less ideological about it, actually really addressing a bit what Katja Heuer has said. We have to move apart the asylum question and actually legal migration. The problem in Germany is primarily that a lot of people who want to come in legal migration have no chance of coming in legal migration. I've seen that with my own wife. My wife is a British refugee, Brexit refugee, so to speak. She has a degree from Oxford. She came with me when I was a German diplomat. She had a job offer in Germany, and even with that, it took her over almost 6 months to get a blue card to actually be able to work in Germany. And the paperwork was so complicated that I, as a German diplomat, did not understand what she was supposed to do. So I had to call my colleagues in the consular services to explain to me what she would have to put in there. And if the only solution in Germany to become legally a German migrant, to legally migrate into Germany for a job, is to marry a German diplomat, that's not a good idea because there are not enough of us. So what we need to do is actually make legal migration much more easy, much more accessible, and much more controlled. And then that would allow for the people who abuse asylum in that respect to actually shift. So we need to shift the rails. We need to shift people who come for the wrong reason. And because asylum is the only way to actually get into Germany, we have to make it possible for them to apply through legal migration. And I think a lot of the problem is not actually the numbers of migrants. A lot of the problem is the sense in the population that it is out of control, that it is not actually through controlled channels. And also the problem, and that is partly also the problem if you use it through the asylum channel, is that we actually had the rule that people who came through asylum for the first 18 months weren't allowed to work. And that is a huge frustration for people, because then the people can't integrate, and the people who are...
Dr. Kremer, I'm sorry, how can you say that 1.2 million Syrians and Afghanis in 2015-16 are not a numerical problem? That is a numerical problem, I'm sorry. It's the numbers as well.
No, but I mean, like, you have 1 million people there, and a lot of them have integrated. But the problem is, if you don't let them work, of course they're not going to be able to integrate as quickly. That is the part of the problem. And a lot of people, and these are 1 million, but we had over the last couple of years, I think, up to 4 million people coming in, and a lot of them came through the asylum way, even though they mainly came because they wanted to work. And what I'm saying is that we have to make it possible for people who want to come to work to Germany. We have to make it possible for them to do that legally, and then keep the asylum part on for people who actually come with asylum. And then, but I want to stop talking because I'm talking too long, but then we actually need the European, the GEAS, the Common European Asylum System, because then the 1 million Syrian refugees would have had a system to actually distribute it, and 1 million among 500 million Europeans is actually feasible. It's much harder for 80 million Germans. But I'm talking too much, so
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Katja, I know you want to add something.
That's okay, I'll wait my turn. Just on the AfD quickly, I think where those two positions come together to some extent is the fact that the AfD is completely divided internally as well. You do have different wings within the party. I mean, when you speak to people on the ground, I'm from the East originally, and you speak to people there, and they go all the way from disgruntled conservatives who've left the Liberal and the Conservative Party over the years and joined them, all the way up to neo-Nazis on the far right and sort of ethno-nationalists on the sort of in the different wings within the party. And I'm not convinced that the leadership under Alice Weidel and Tino Chrupalla have got enough control over what is going on further down in the party to be an indication as to what the party is. So when, for instance, Alice Weidel goes out there and does interviews with international media and speaks to Elon Musk and so on, then she is the face of the party, particularly to English speakers who haven't got access to all of the sort of debates within Germany, she is able, because she speaks English and because her background as a sort of economist really allows her to speak in a certain way, come across in a certain way. She is able to portray that part of the party. She is also part of that early intake that Dr. Kremer was talking about in 2013 when the party started off as a sort of libertarian Eurosceptic party, not as a professor's party, basically. And she is part of that intake, but equally, and this is where Dr. Kremer is right as well, is that she's able to and willing to take on the more extremist elements within her party and make political hay with it. So one example that happened recently that sort of opened my eyes to that was that she was trying to take the far-right term remigration out of the AfD manifesto. So in the draft manifesto, she'd taken it out of the actual written document because she knows that this makes it impossible for her to have a coalition with the Conservatives. But she was overruled by her own party with a really high vote of 70-odd% at the party conference in January, and they had to put it back in. And then she took on the word once she realized actually this is something that her own party is always going to do, regardless of what she wants. She took then on this word and basically shouted it back at the party conference, completely embracing it and saying, fine, if it's to be called remigration, then we'll do remigration. And she shouted literally the individual syllables back at her party. So I think what makes her quite an effective or dangerous, whichever way you want to see it, individual, is the fact that she is willing to embrace these different streams within her party precisely because she has no control over them. She was part of that group of people who tried to chuck Björn Höcke, the sort of more extreme representative, out of the party in 2017. That didn't work because he'd already established too much of of a base within the party, and then she just made her peace with him and is happy for that to be part of the same party. And I think that means that basically anyone can look at the party and see exactly what they want in it, because you just pick the individual politicians who represent the thing that you want the AfD to be. And that's why you get such different kind of approaches to it. And the other thing is that because they have suddenly grown so much, over the last few years, they often do not have enough people on the ground to fill the positions that they suddenly get elected into. So when you look at communal level, suddenly they're supposed to have, 10 councillors in a particular town, and they only have 5 people. The vetting process becomes incredibly thin. They're quite happy for people to just join the party and kind of come on board. So quite often, you do now get complete extremists and lunatics at ground level because they've recently come to the fold now that the party is so successful. And again, because there's no kind of direct control from the leadership down, they haven't kind of reformed the party or cleansed it, if you want to use a slightly controversial term, of the kind of more extremist elements, because A, there's no desire to do so, because at the moment they don't have to. Nobody's going to have a coalition anyway with them, so why would they moderate? And on the flip side, they can't. They tried in the past and it hasn't worked. So I think that's where those two positions maybe come together to some extent. And then on immigration, I won't say too much on it because I've been talking for some time now already, but I do think it's partially a numerical problem simply because the resources just aren't there. So to put one figure on it, in terms of unemployment benefits in Germany right now, the so-called Bürgergeld, 48% of that go to people without a German passport. So whatever people think of that, and whatever the reasons for that, partially it is because people aren't allowed to work, but it does mean that half of the benefits effectively go to people who've just arrived, and therefore the system, economically speaking, is completely skewed. So that's why you get a result now where the kind of voter base of the AfD is the working class. It's basically people who are saying, why am I going to work and earning just about enough money to get my family through at the end of every month, and at the same time my taxes are being used to prop people up who've only just arrived. And that means that when you look at the statistic, that 38% of working class voters voted for the AfD. That's huge, and it's I think a statistic that hasn't had enough attention in Germany. It's, by the way, the same demographic that also voted for Donald Trump and for Marine Le Pen and for the FPÖ in Austria, and it's something that has partially to do with the numbers and the resources. It's also because the people who use public transport, who are out and about in society, less shielded, they can shield their children less from the impact of that. All of that has got a
because here Reform UK
Reform
UK appeals to much older clientele, whereas in Germany I think it's working class but also working age people between 25 and 45. That's where the AfD votes came from. It's extraordinary. It's really quite different from this country.
Great, thanks very much. Well, obviously, we know that we have an audience chomping at the bit here to ask questions. I do want to put one final question, though, to the panel, and if you can make your responses relatively brief, even though I know it's quite a big theme. And I want to return here to a point that Martin raised earlier about this lack of vision. And of course, Toby, you mentioned this too when you talked about the Germany-sized hole, of course, when it comes to security defense policy and indeed other policies at the European level. And Katja, you also, of course, mentioned this. You talked about energy. I mean, this will, of course, trigger me. I did my PhD here previously looking at Germany as a case study for energy. So we can certainly delve into that in the Q&A. But the fundamental point here is this notion of a lack of vision, which, again, is not a new issue. I mean, I remember back in 2012 attending a conference. There was the German conference at Harvard. They organized this every year. And the theme of that conference in 2012 was the angst of German leadership. And the underlying topic here was why there wasn't more of a vision here. And the question then is, what will it take, right? We have the largest conflict in Europe since the Second World War. This is a massive crisis, right, amongst many other crises that Germany and indeed Europe more broadly is facing. So if that lack of vision isn't being solved in the midst of such acute crisis, what will it actually take? Or is it more of an intrinsic problem with the system, the political system in Germany, and indeed perhaps, of course, the cultural issues and anything else you can read into this? I realize it's a big topic. I know we need to go to audience questions, but I think it's really important that we address this. So Katja, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, this is me as a historian speaking now, but I think it's intrinsic to the German post-war identity almost. This kind of, when you look at the Cold War, you basically had West Germany very firmly allied with the US, so it became a member of NATO. and basically decided under Konrad Adenauer, the first West German Chancellor, that it was intrinsically a Western country and would follow the American lead on things. And on the flip side, even more extremely, you've got East Germany basically has its foreign policy dictated to it by the Soviet Union. So again, both of these countries did have a lot of military spending, and they, people now look at the GDP figures of both of those during the Cold War and say, well, how was it possible for East and West Germany to spend up to sort of 5% or so of GDP on defense? But it wasn't strategically sort of aligned to German interests as such, but it was aligned to each bloc. And now suddenly, after the reunification of Germany, which obviously happened at the same time as the collapse of that world order, when the Cold War ended, there was the notion of the end of history, and I think that was particularly appealing to Germans, who were sort of thinking of it as finally the end to their horrific 20th century history, as the happy ending to that, the reward for the long division, for the punishment that people felt they'd taken. And the kind of, wars then happened to other regions of the world, no longer to Germany, and Germany could decide on a case-by-case basis, take Iraq as an example, where they decided to stay out, or Afghanistan, where they decided to take more of a kind of different role compared to Britain and France, but they did get involved in that, and it was kind of like it's not our problem, we don't need to think about these things, when a war happens, we can decide, do we want to get involved or not? So we haven't moved out of that really, I would say, at all as a modern country, out of that mindset that other people decide or other countries decide what's happening in the world. Germany still talks of itself as a Mittelmacht, a middling power, meaning not a great power, not a superpower. Even though it's the third largest economy in the world, it sees itself on the same level, as, I don't know, Belgium, or no offense to Belgium, I'm just saying, in terms of its role in the world, it doesn't understand, I think, the huge amount of weight that whatever it does has because of its economic power and because of its position in Europe. And that, I think, makes it even more reluctant, almost people being kind of afraid of themselves. When you say that to Germans, they turn around and they say quite often to you, well, the last time we did strategy, it went terribly wrong. Meaning the Second World War, of course, and the First World War. And out of that mindset, I think people haven't really quite moved out of that. And I don't know what it takes to make people do that, to be honest. It would be a brave person to step forward and say, German interests matter. I mean, the last time we had that, who said that with the German interests being defended in the Hindukush, and got a lot of kind of pushback for that. I forget who it was. I think was it even the president, wasn't it, under Köhler? I can't remember, but basically there's a huge debate around that when people said the Afghanistan intervention that Germany was a part of was in the German interest, and then suddenly there was a big debate, is Germany even allowed to have interests? So I'm not entirely convinced that we are seeing a move out of that, even though, as I said at the beginning, we should, given the amount of money that is now being spent on it.
Thank you. Martin.
Think what you will of Donald Trump, but he was completely right when he said that German defense spending was disgraceful. Nie wieder Krieg was a convenient excuse for Germany to remain a military or foreign political dwarf while being or becoming an export-oriented economic giant. Right? It was convenient. It worked for Germany not to take responsibility foreign politically, militarily, and focus on the economy.
Toby.
Yes, I mean, that I share that this Trump shouldn't have been a wake-up call, but Trump was your alarm ringing again after you've pressed the snooze button for about 20, 30, 40 years, maybe. I remember, I think Henry Kissinger already called for us to actually spend a bit more on defense and do burden sharing. But that is the one side. The question of vision, though, I think is a really interesting one. And I agree that it's partly also a cultural and identity issue. Because, I mean, I often think whenever I hear the word vision, I think of the classic Helmut Schmidt, wer Vision hat, soll zum Arzt gehen. Whoever has a vision should go and see a doctor. Whoever has visions should go see a doctor. And I think that is still very much what the German feeling is. Like, we have very much adopted after the Second World War, a very pragmatic approach. And actually Germans don't like visionaries. You saw that, and it doesn't matter which party they're from. You saw that with the Agenda 2010 by Gerhard Schröder. He lost the elections because he did something visionary like that. We now reap some of the benefits still. And then Angela Merkel actually almost lost the elections because her party had a relatively visionary, in the more neoliberal sense, but visionary idea of how to turn the economy much more liberal. And her lesson from that was to not be visionary ever again. And I think German voters actually don't like visionary politicians. And in some ways, I sometimes wonder whether being visionary is really the solution. I say that as somebody who now spends much more time than he'd like to in Strasbourg, in France, and where we see a lot of very visionary politics. But very often not backed up by anything. Macron says all the right things, and I think he's really intellectually very interesting. He has a lot of strategic, visionary things, but very often it's not backed up. And one thing that I hear, for instance, when I talk to our Eastern European partners or even Ukraine, they say we actually prefer the slow German leadership from behind, so to speak, that they are not all out about explaining the world to everybody, but once a decision is taken, it's actually moving there. I'm not necessarily saying that's the best way, but I don't think that just having a vision is solving the problem, because you can probably ask a lot of Frenchmen. I'm not sure they are much happier with their political leadership than Germans are.
Great. Well, on that note, I would like to open it up to audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. A microphone will be brought to you. And if you could just quickly introduce yourself, so say your name, what your affiliation is, and who, if you have a particular speaker you'd like to direct your question to, or otherwise the panel as a whole. I see one hand raised there at the back.
Hello, my name's Hannah. I'm studying an MPhil in Politics International Studies. Thank you very much specifically to Dr. Kramer for his comments. I'm sad to have to waste this opportunity to ask a question on reacting to Dr. Ruel's comment about Alexander Gauland, which I must say is so naive that given his considerable educational background, I can only describe it as apologist. And personally, I feel like you should feel ashamed about this.
Please, let's take a couple.
Wait, sorry, that was a question directed
at
me.
We'll bring that
should
back.
say something.
We'll bring that back. We just have one more question.
Hello, I'm Hina Salam. I'm a pediatrician here at Edinburgh. This is more not a question but a comment to the panel. I'm extremely worried when there are considerations that AfD should not be classified as extremist. I acknowledge it's a matter of law and definition. I don't know the intricacies. However, to me, with a migrant background, being born and brought up in Germany, the numbers and the turnout is worrying. Knowing that 85% of voters, it's the highest voter turnout at this election, and out of those, more than 20% voted AfD. CDU is probably more the sophisticated version, or in terms of their views on migration, in terms of their approach to conservatism. It is a worrying state for those who come from, have a migrant background in Germany. Many of my friends who are the so-called, how you would say, Bildungselite, are worrying and worry about and considering about leaving the country. And to that, Dr. Kramer's comment is very valid in terms of the difficulties that migrants, asylum seekers who really would like to work as soon as possible. But I remember comments from my parents 40, 50 years ago that there was a stamp on their pass which said similar, you can't work. And that has not changed in 40, 50 years. And that is something that needs to be highlighted to the public, and in particular the younger people who have voted for AfD. It's not that the majority of migrants, asylum seekers are lazy and rejoice the benefits. They want to work, but it's the law, the legislation that is preventing them, and that needs to change.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, in 1 second. So thanks very much. Again, we had the first question on Gauland, the comment just now. Thank you very much for that, on the classification of the AfD, as, extremist classification, but also the broader point about integration, I think, which is very well taken. Do we have any other questions? I'll take one more, and then we'll come to another round. So we'll take that question there. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Hi, I'm Pierre Labatte. I'm a planner here in Cambridge, but I studied politics. I don't know if it's a comment or a suggestion, but this is also for Dr. Martin Höhle. You mentioned France a lot in this debate, and I'm quite surprised about it because you said that in order to combat the AfD, it is necessary to address the points they're raising, especially the concerns in terms of immigration and insecurity. I hear that, and I understand that it's also important not to just cry wolf and call this party just fascist in Code Day, because that's not how you engage with voters, especially people who are already voting for the AfD and quite convinced in their ways. Nevertheless, I think that using the example of France is really bad in that sense, because Macron's strategy has been to normalize the issues that was brought up by the far right, and what it has only done is push the window of Omerton towards the right to an extent where we now have ministers of security and ministers of defense that are extremely, large figures of the far right in the country. And it has only offended more the left and secured the right in their statement that, the country should do more against immigration. So it just hasn't helped at all in fighting. I mean, you can see it in the polls. So I'm just surprised that this is a suggestion that you would make.
Great, thank you very much. We'll give our speakers a chance to respond to those comments and then questions, and then we'll go to another round. Martin, you first.
Very quickly, maybe. So as I think I indicated before, I do think that the AfD has got a huge radical core, and that in the terms of the numbers, it is larger than the moderate end of it. That's why Alice Weidel has basically failed trying to moderate the party. I'm not even convinced that she moderated it for the benefit of moderating it, but actually because she thought it would make it politically more able to basically come to power that way. So I think for her, it's entirely about the best way for the AfD to come to power rather than the inherent kind of party differences there. But it is at core, I think, as we've seen with those votes at the party conference were really interesting, actually, because they did put some numbers on where the radical wing is and where the more liberal wing is within the party. And if 70% of the party say we want that remigration concept, which does come out of the far right, is the Austrian Martin Sellner far-right kind of activist who's come up with that concept. And if there's 70% in the party who think that that should be party manifesto, then that puts a number, I think, on the kind of more radical wing of it. On immigration, I would say we're doing the same thing again, in that we're sliding back into a very, very generic idea of immigration good or immigration bad sort of thing. That doesn't work. If you carry on like that and you basically just say to the German public, we have to just have open borders, because migrants are a good thing, you are going to offend more and more people with that, and eventually they will vote the AfD into power. It needs to be a more controlled approach to immigration, where you do say, yes, Germany does need migrant labor, it does need that, and it also has a responsibility in terms of its humanitarian role to play. But both of these things can't mean that we're just going to have completely open borders, because then you do have the security implications and all the problems that come with that, and eventually the opposite happens of what people who have that approach want, namely you will get far-right parties into power that way. So I think, once again, I would just urge to have a debate that is a bit more nuanced about this, because that then allows migrants who live in Germany to work, to get kind of to a stage, as Dr. Kremer was saying as well, in terms of just the sheer bureaucracy that is in the way of people being able to work, those kinds of things, they need sorting out. But that you can't at the same time say to sort of somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the population that their concerns about the scale of migration that they've seen and the real security implications we've had with the attacks that we've had over the last year with people being stabbed to death, with attacks on the streets, those kinds of things. They're both true at the same time, and there needs to be, I think, a more nuanced and just a calmer debate about these things that can't, where one side doesn't dismiss the other all the time, basically, because that just leads to polarization, I think.
Martin, the point about Gauland and the French comparison, please.
Yeah, I think those were important points that Katja raised just now. Just coming to your point here in the second row, of the 7 million voters who voted in 2025 just now with a Migrationshintergrund, more than 20% actually, so more than the national average, voted for the AfD. This is something to consider, that even former migrants, people with Migrationshintergrund, support a party that seems to be anti-immigration. Maybe something to consider.
Sorry, what's the connection there to what she said?
The lady said that she thought, as herself, with a migratory background, she found that the AfD was basically unacceptable. And there are clearly a lot of people with migration backgrounds in Germany who find it not just acceptable, but electable.
But that doesn't make the party less problematic.
How is it problematic?
Okay, well, if we can take a question from you in the next round. Do you want to clarify the point about France, the French comparison? Okay. Right, Toby, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Then I take up I mean, it's actually an interesting debate. I don't want to go too much into it, but it's similar development we see in France. We see in the US that more and more people from minority backgrounds are actually voting for Trump, and I actually think that is part, very often not necessarily about just migration. This is a bit the first part that I also talked about. I think what the AfD is also trying to capitalize on is basically the culture wars issues. Is like what I mean. Like, I'm from the Ruhr Valley. I'm from Bochum. We just beat Bayern München, so I have to celebrate a little bit. But I'm from the Ruhr Valley, which is probably has one of the longest migration histories. So we had migration history for about 160 years, and there are very few people. I think in my class I was one of 3 who didn't have any sort of migration background. But it's actually very well integrated over the years, and I would say that work is actually the best migration, the best way of integration, because they used to all work, they used to all be minors, and then it really didn't matter. It was like everybody was black with coal, and nobody could really see that as a way of really integrating. There's a very strong ethos of being workers. But what I will say is that I also saw a lot of people from migrant communities who were voting AfD, but usually not because of they were unhappy with migration, but very often because they had a reaction against what they would call woke, or they had a reaction against what they would consider generally security issues. We call that in Germany SOS topics, Sicherheit, Ordnung, Sauberkeit. So security, order, and even cleanliness, the broken window theory. And I think that actually brings us back on the one hand to the question of culture wars that the far right can capitalize on, and sometimes left-wing parties actually galvanize it if they go into that competition. And on the other hand, the sense that the government or that like the state doesn't actually do what is needed to do to be in control, to actually do what the government is supposed to be. This idea, this sense that there's an incapacity of acting, and I think this is one of the really key issues where we have to do something now about. And where I very much hope that the 500 billion infrastructure program, that is where about a very I think it's 50 billion. I don't know whether they raised it to 100 billion. It's actually reserved for the states and for local entities, that they can actually start repairing and getting together the infrastructure. I think that is a very key point that will be very necessary there. But I want to very briefly address the Macron issue, and I think it is absolutely right what Macron's strategy was very selfishly for him very clever, but I think very short-sighted, because what basically he did was to create a polarization between him and the far right, to basically say this is between me and Le Pen, because he thought, and he probably was right, that if he had gone into the second round in 2017 against Fillon, he might have lost. So he really tried to create a grand coalition of center-right, center-left all around him, and then the alternative is Marine Le Pen, and it worked for him because people rallied around him. And said, okay, if he's the only alternative to Le Pen, that's okay. But the problem is if you keep doing that, you don't have alternatives between democratic parties, and you end up having all democratic parties against the far right. And the problem we have in France now is often the perception, because Macron said, I'm the only alternative to Le Pen, means that Le Pen is the only alternative to him. And if people are starting to be fed up with him, they feel like they don't have a different alternative. And I think that the lesson we have to take from that is that it's absolutely wrong to say like, oh, you just have to vote Democratic parties and Democratic parties against the far right. We have to say why I, for instance, want you to vote social democratic rather than free democratic or Christian democratic. I actually think we need more polarization between the democratic parties. I want to much rather fight with the CDU about I don't know, the debt break. I want to fight with the Greens about ecological policy, and I think we have to really get this polarization. Actually, this campaign had the potential to be like that, because both Scholz and Merz actually started talking about.
Dr. Kremer, thank you so much. I think we must have a few more questions here.
Well,
Okay,
Toby, do you want to just finish that sentence and then we'll take the last round?
Yeah, no, I was basically about to be done. It is that they were about to talk about the
Right. Well, while it gets unfrozen. Right. Okay. Thanks very much, Toby. So one last round of questions. So please raise your hand. I think there were two. Okay, I see. Yeah, keep your hand raised so we can see. Right. And so just quickly introduce yourself. Please ask a question. So I want a question mark at the end of whatever remark you make, and then we'll bring it back to the panel. Thanks very much. Starting with.
My name is Friedrich. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Department of Biochemistry. The dualism in the Christian Democratic Union, specifically when it comes to foreign policy, is basically the Goist and Atlanticist view. Friedrich Merz is, of course, well known, or was known as an Atlanticist, and is now rather shifting towards the Goist side. So, what is your point of view? We are now facing a more European foreign policy, also in the Financial Times, I think it was mentioned that we have a new triumvirate of Starmer, Macron, and Merz in the future. So I would be quite curious what you think about that.
Thank you. And then the next question, please keep your hand raised if you have a question, so we can make sure. Right, let's go. Right, the gentleman there, and I think the third. Yes, correct. Thank you.
I was just wondering, of course, the rise of the far right, if you want to call it that, is a European-wide phenomena. But at the same time, what you see is the rise of the AfD in Germany concentrated in the post-Soviet landscape of East Germany. I was wondering how we should make sense of both the universal rise of the far right across Europe as a phenomena that swept both West and Eastern Europe, but also the way in which it responds to a post-Soviet landscape as well.
Thank you very much. And then please raise your hand. I think there was another question right at the back there. Thank you.
My question is primarily directed at Dr. Kremer, and insofar as it seems, is it flawed to want to reframe the discourse towards ecology and these other issues when clearly questions of migration have such great sway over 20% of the German population?
Right. Any other questions? Last chance. Great. Let's go. Let's start from the end, actually. Toby, did you hear that last question?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I think it's always the question between demand and supply. Of course, you need to address the issue of migration. I think that is beyond the question. But in some ways, we actually only talk about it at a moment where we are under massive geopolitical threat, at a moment where we have probably the highest level of social inequality, I think, about since the French Revolution, at the moment where actually the main problem when you talk to people is that they can't pay their rent, and all of these topics we didn't really talk about, because we only talked about one issue. And I'm not saying that you can't talk about that issue. Of course, you have to address that issue. But we can't just talk about that issue. That would actually be much too short. And I think the mistake is very often For the AfD, I completely get they just want to talk about that one issue, be my guest. But I think the other parties also need to talk about the other issues, which are very, very existential. So I don't think it's an either or. But me as a social democrat, I will talk about the social issue. I will talk about rents that are too high, the fact that people can't actually afford to live, the fact that there's such a big social inequality. I think that is a topic that I want to talk about. That is one of the reasons why I went into politics.
Thanks very much. Katja, would you like to address the second question about the rise of the far right across both the east and west of Europe, etc.?
Sure. So you're right, I think, in saying that the AfD has grown kind of universal, or not the AfD, the far right or right-wing populists have grown universally, but there's a particular stronghold certainly within Germany in the east, and it's interesting that the AfD recognized that right from the beginning, basically, of its sharp rise after 2015. So when you look at people like Björn Höcke, for example, who is the leader in the state of Thuringia, the most aggressive chapter, I would say, and also at the same time the most successful one. He won the state-level election there last year. They're all West Germans that get sent basically from the West into the East specifically because the AfD has recognized that that's fertile territory. And as far as I've seen in terms of the election posters and just the way that the campaign was run, the AfD ran a specific East German campaign in the East as well. So it was using slogans like, the East is rising up, or the East is where it's at. You know, they'd all even complete the peaceful revolution, meaning, you know, you fought for a freer world you fought against the dictatorship in 1989, do it again now. Or, you know, they're kind of utilizing these feelings of discontent and of disgruntlement, I think, in the East particularly well. Having said that, the breakdown by social class is much more interesting because of the way that basically East Germany for 40 years had a socialist system. So basically people weren't able to accumulate private wealth, they weren't able to become middle class effectively. So you have a largely working class dominated society in the East, which is why you see these kind of quite high figures basically of AfD voting, I think, on top of the issue of kind of a stubborn reaction to the things that people feel have gone wrong since 1990. I think both these things overlay. And then thirdly, people are just really, really tired of change. All the sociologists basically tell you that basically they've had a huge amount of change since 1990, with huge amounts of unemployment. Helmut Kohl massively overpromised what was going to happen, and then you had up to a fifth of people unemployed in the early 2000s. And even the people who weren't unemployed often had to do new jobs, completely different things from what they did before, often a lot lower in terms of the social status than what they previously had. Labor was devalued, which is something that we also see in the US and in Britain and in France, fueling this sort of same development. But it's particularly strong in a society where labor was, you know, because of its socialism, where that was central, and working class culture was basically venerated during the East German era, and then afterwards it turned into the opposite. And suddenly if you were a miner or a factory worker, you were kind of, your status wasn't what it was previously. And so I think all of these things play a role. The political parties, if you think from a West German perspective, both the CDU, CSU and the SPD, you have very, very positive experiences with both of these parties. The CDU is the party of the economic miracle after the Second World War. The SPD is the party that took the kind of stuffy conservativeness out of West German society. They're both good things. From an East German perspective, the CDU is the party that overpromised things in 1990 and then led to a lot of unemployment. And then the SPD comes in with Gerhard Schröder and does the Agenda 2010. And yes, it sort of worked to revive the economy, but at the same time it brought zero-hour contracts and a sort of more liberal world in which labor was devalued at the same time. So neither of these, and then Angela Merkel came in and basically stood for the migration policy as well on top of that. And again, a lot of change happening. So I think all of these things come together and create a really complex sense of the world as it is isn't working. And that's why people go, I think, for more radical changes more quickly in the post-Soviet societies. But I don't really know what the answer to that is, other than trying to work out basically what it is that people are unhappy with and trying to defeat that on a political level. I think if you actually banned the AfD, you'd run into trouble very quickly because people would fight back against that even more violently, I think, than they currently are.
Martin.
To Friedrich's question about Atlanticism, it's an irony of history that Friedrich Merz, who is the hyper-Atlanticist in many ways, is now overseeing Germany's departure from this transatlanticist tie with America. But it's the hand that Donald Trump dealt him, that he couldn't choose that. Westintegration, Atlanticism, that goes back to Adenauer, of course, one of Adenauer's, you might say, great achievements. The other form, political achievement, that he's often credited with is reparations to Israel and this making, I guess, the support of Israel, Germany's Staatsräson. And this brings me to another point. A lot of people here in the audience who feel strongly about Gaza, the Israeli-Palestinian war, of course, think, how could Germany unconditionally support Israel through this? Yeah? That's shocking to you. But it has the same reason that we demonize the AfD. Yeah? We are the country that caused the Holocaust. That is our guilt, that is our responsibility. And for that reason, we Germans, myself included, feel responsible towards Israel. Angela Merkel, but long before her, Helmut Kohl, right, they all made the gesture going back to Adenauer. We stand by Israel no matter what. So think this through, right? The Germans have to address their past differently. This cannot be the lesson to be learned from the Holocaust, to support Israel unconditionally in the war in Gaza. Do you see what I'm talking about? It's only the other side of the coin. You can feel left and feel completely outraged by what Germany and America did there. Yeah? In 2023, the latest Gaza war. Yeah? But it's the same outrage that you feel about Gauland or Höcke and those people. Yeah? It's connected.
Thank you very much. Toby, just because you are very much in the belly of the beast here, working on these issues on the Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the Subcommittee on Security and Defense. Do you think, would you address this first question that we had about whether we will see more of a Gaullist approach to European foreign and security policy in the years ahead?
I've been asked yesterday by French television whether I'd now call myself a Gaullist, and I still said no. But I think what we do see is actually quite impressively that Vance, Musk, and Trump have achieved in a bit more than a month what Stalin, Khrushchev, and Putin have not achieved in 80 years. That is really putting into fundamental question the transatlantic alliance, putting into fundamental question America's claim to global leadership, and really putting into question the legacy of post-war presidents from FDR to Ronald Reagan. And I mean, I'm personally transatlanticist. I hope that is not the end, but I think it is becoming very, very clear to more and more Europeans that we cannot wait for America to potentially come back. Hope is not a strategy, and that Europe is understanding that it doesn't only have to wake up, but to finally stand up, and that actually in some ways, in both scenarios, whether you are transatlanticist or whether you are Gaullist, in both scenarios, the strategy must be the same. That is to take more responsibility on defense, to spend more on that, and to actually grow up finally. Because if you are transatlanticist, that's the only way to keep the Americans on board. If you actually have a burden sharing, and if you're a Gaullist and you think the Americans are going to bugger off anyways, that's the only way to be able to have security. So I think in the end, it's in this respect, I'm maybe more of a traditionally German pragmatist. I think what we have to do in both scenarios, whether you're a Gaullist or transatlanticist, is the same. Europe has to finally get up and look after its own defense and actually invest in that. It can't be the case that 450 Europeans are defended by 350 million Americans against 160 million Russians.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I realize that we have drinks at the back of the room, which I'm sure the audience will be relieved to hear. Can we please give a very... Not for you, I'm afraid, Toby. I'm sure you have champagne or something else in Brussels, certainly. Can we please give our esteemed panel a big round of applause for their contributions today?